This is Egypt's remote biblical desert of Scetis in Wadi Nutrun, where Coptic Christians believe the Holy Family sought refuge on their flight into Egypt. Here lies Deir al-Surian, monastery of the Syrians, founded as a Coptic community over 1,500 years ago, one of only 4 to survive out of some 600 known to exist in the 3rd century. Over time, it welcomed monks from across the Levant and Ethiopia, especially from Syria, after whom it was named. 3 Syrian monks, Matthew, Abraham and Theodore, were responsible for establishing the first library of ancient Christian texts here in the 9th century. Modern scholarship owes them a huge debt. Little did they know that their library would eventually become one of the oldest and most important surviving collections of ancient Christian manuscripts in the world, a treasure house of the world's memory. From that time on, gifts of ancient texts from the vast region of Syria and Mesopotamia became increasingly frequent, confirming Egypt's role in the global evolution of writing and bookmaking. In AD 922, the Christian monasteries in Egypt were faced with a dire financial crisis. They were now required by the new Caliph al-Muqtadir to pay the poll tax. The abbot of al-Surian, Moses of Nisbis, went to Baghdad to negotiate. It took 5 years, but while waiting, Moses was not idle. He spent his time on a spending spree that would add a further 250 early Syriac manuscripts to the library by AD 932. This gift would form the core of the monastery's collection, which later increased to include Coptic, Ethiopic, and Christian Arabic texts, covering the Gospels, biblical and theological writings, homilies and historiographies of the Desert Fathers, as well as translations of philosophy, medicine, and science, whose original Greek texts have been lost. By the 11th century, Deir al-Surian was already known to be a centre of learning, religious art, and cultural exchange, establishing its reputation as one of the richest ancient libraries in Christendom. Good news travels fast. During a period of monastic decline, Western collectors found easy pickings. Vatican emissaries in the 18th century, and Robert Curzon in the 19th, removed much of the monastery's original collection, which today lies in Rome, Paris, and London. For centuries, the collection was stored in the monastery's 9th century keep, or Tower of Refuge, where, in 1837, Robert Curzon discovered the hidden Coptic and Syriac manuscripts. He and his servants departed laden with old books, but he had to leave the largest behind. He later wrote, "I now have reason to believe that this was the famous book with the date AD 411, the most precious acquisition to any library that has been made in modern times." The British Museum later sent envoys to purchase this precious book and over 600 volumes from the monks who had no idea of their real value. Collectively, these now form one of the chief treasures of the British Library. The monastery now closed its doors. By 1997, rescue was at hand thanks to monk librarian Father Beygoul, who invited conservator Elizabeth Subchinsky from London to assess the situation. With the consent of His Grace Bishop Mataus, Elizabeth established the Levantine Foundation to raise funds for the preservation of the collection in partnership with the monastic council.
I just wrote to her a little detailed letter. Yeah, I'm very happy to hear that.
When I received a letter in the autumn of '96, a letter from an unknown monk from the Western Desert, and as it turned out, it was Father Beygoul, the monk. And in this letter, he describes to me a collection of manuscript which is being housed in their monastery, asking for help in the preservation. I must admit, I didn't know anything about this collection until I have received this letter. And yes, I have decided to go, and that's how the adventure started. And the journey was quite amazing, first through the desert road, and then we drove into the desert. We saw this amazing view of a monastery whose outline reminds of a Noah's Ark, blended in color, really beautiful with the surrounding of the desert. We arrived there, we were very welcomed and hosted, and we waited for a permission from Bishop Mataeus, abbot of the monastery, to enter the library. And eventually permission was granted, and we walked to the top of this tower where the modern library was. And when he opened the door, again, similarly like with the arriving to the monastery, the experience was unforgettable. Everything was dark. There were only strands of sun coming through the window shutters, and there was quite distinct a smell of a chemical which I later found out was used for fumigation against incense. I must say that the books were really well organized and kept in a very good order. They were all stored in wooden cabinets with glazed door, and though of course there was a lot of dust because we are talking about the library in the desert, they were tidy and otherwise clean, and so I was very impressed. But when I came to actually look at individual manuscripts, of course I realized that these manuscripts are not in a perfect condition, but I would not expect them to be in a perfect condition because some of them were and are 1500 years old.
The monastery at Deir al-Surian possesses a polyglot library of inimitable treasures in the form of over 1,500 codices and many more fragments. These constitute one of the largest collections in the entire Coptic Orthodox Church. The library is considered one of the key bridges of communication in the Christian world, and an invaluable source for studying the medium of writing, the types of illumination and bindings, and styles of restoration used at various times. Here, we will take a closer look at the Coptic Arabic, Syriac, and the Ethiopic collections in the Deir al-Surian library.
The Coptic Arabic collection at Deir al-Surian is hugely important, as it serves to preserve and create elements of a distinctively Coptic Orthodox identity. Among volumes and a large number of valuable fragments, there are some that deserve special mention. The first is a unique New Testament on parchment, dated late 11th century. It contains the entire text of St. John's Gospel and is the earliest complete example that exists in any Coptic Orthodox library. Secondly, there is an important volume on parchment dating from 1181 AD, which contains the liturgy of the inauguration of the new churches. It is the earliest known volume on this subject in the entire Coptic Church. Thirdly, an illuminated and ornamentally decorated New Testament, 4 Gospels on Arabic paper dated 1220 AD, one of the most important in the collection. It was written by the scribe Simon ibn Peter in the monastery scriptorium and has remained there ever since. It is an outstanding work of art and literature, richly decorated with images of the 4 evangelists, a full-page cross, and stylized birds and flowers throughout the book. Finally, a bilingual collection of dual Coptic Arabic, written as parallel texts, examples of the language shift in Coptic culture between 8th and 13th centuries. Arabic took over as the dominant language from the 14th century.
Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, which was the language of the Middle East between ancient Mesopotamia and Arabic. So it was in the Middle East as the main language for about over 1,000 years, probably more than that. And it eventually ended up with many different dialects. A number of works which were translated from Greek into Syriac, philosophical works, which are preserved in manuscripts in Deir al-Surian. They're often not well-known works. One is attributed to Aristotle. It was actually very influential both in Syriac and in Latin. It's the known as On the Universe, and that survives in a manuscript from Deir al-Surian, a 6th century or early 7th century manuscript. And the other fragment which you might talk about is actually minute. I recognized it pretty well at once as part of the earliest dated literary manuscript in any Christian language of the Orient, which is in the British Library, dated 411. And right at the end of this manuscript, a list of names, written very beautifully, of Persian martyrs. In the British Library manuscript, you can see that it's a very dismal-looking page with most of the text is lost. And amongst the bits that lost are the names of the women martyrs. But on the fragment, in fact the several fragments, it turned out, still in Deir al-Surian, we can reconstruct the names of the women martyrs. So it's a rather nice thing where you can piece together all sorts of things from just a very small fragment. Although we don't have from Deir al-Surian manuscripts in the great translation movement of the 9th century, what we do have are manuscripts from the earlier translation movement, the very beginnings of translation of Greek philosophy and medicine, which goes back to the 6th century, and that's what fragments usually survive at Deir al-Surian. In other cases, we've got a few manuscripts from elsewhere, but it's the older authors from the 5th, 6th century, 4th, 5th, 6th century that we really owe so much to Deir al-Surian.
The Ethiopic manuscript collection at Deir al-Surian is not large, but it's a fine piece of cultural heritage and a product of cross-cultural contacts. The collection in its entirety is a significant source that contains information of various types on the history and culture of 3 countries in Africa, Ethiopia and Eritrea and Egypt. From the point of view of the manuscript studies, the collection is significant as an example of a case when, let's say, representatives of one civilization migrate and take their manuscript culture with them, and then they keep producing manuscripts at a new place in diaspora. More than half of the Ethiopic manuscripts kept at Deir al-Surian have been copied and bound in Egypt.
Ethiopian and Eritrean manuscripts located outside of Ethiopia and Eritrea, and not only because it has been brought there, but it has also been partly produced in Egypt. So we see here materials used that are not normally used in the Ethiopian and Eritrean manuscript production, and we see approaches to manuscript production that stem from this context in which the producers, presumably the monks at the monastery Deir al-Surian, lived.
Many Christian literary works from Egypt, first in Greek and then in Arabic, were translated and incorporated into the literature of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Many Egyptian saints are still venerated in Ethiopia and Eritrea. So Egypt was seen by Ethiopians as the country of great Christian culture, the country of holy places, of exemplary monastic tradition. On the less official level, we also should know that scores of pilgrims, mostly monks, tried to reach the Holy Land, Jerusalem, via Sudan and Egypt. Small Ethiopian communities emerged as a kind of stations on the pilgrimage routes, and one of these stations was exactly at Deir al-Surian.
I first learnt about the Levantine Foundation in 2006 when I was British ambassador in Egypt. The executive director, Elizabeth Sobczynski, and the trustees of the foundation visited Nadia and myself in the embassy, and we learnt about the efforts that they were making
to help the monks in Deir al-Surian preserve their library of ancient manuscripts for future generations.
Paramount to this project was our partnership with the Monastic Council and the Deir al-Surian, but also in 2007 the Levantine Foundation received NGO status in Egypt, and this enabled and facilitated other partnerships within institutions such as National Library and Archives in Egypt, the Supreme Council of Antiquities, and most recently the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities.
Soon after that, we got to know the head of the monastery, Bishop Mataeus, and the librarian, Father Beygoul. We were impressed by their commitment, their determination to ensure that the best protection of the manuscripts and to make them accessible to scholarship, and by the collaboration between them and the Levantine Foundation.
A new library was designed, a library proper, which is actually sunk in the ground, and the reason for it was that climate underground is more stable than above the ground, so that's where the storage of this collection is, and the manuscripts are stored in the latest design of metal cabinets, because we felt that it offers the best protection. On the ground floor, we've got educational facilities, including an auditorium. Monks can arrive and listen to lectures and do workshops there as well. Then we also have a conservation lab. We've got reading rooms. We've got digitizing rooms. We don't have yet a full digitizing equipment, but I hope that maybe funding will be found to do that. So it is actually not only a library, but it's a working library with educational facilities, which really is probably one of the best in Egypt. The training of local community is absolutely essential. They cannot rely on foreign NGOs coming and helping them. This is very sporadic and it is not sustainable. So in order to make it sustainable, a local conservators, local preservation officers, local archaeologists, and basically local specialists have to be trained. Training in conservation is very, very long, but it can be done. It can be done in separate modules which were continuing, and by doing this we are providing a local workforce which can actually take care of collection care as well as conservation and museology and everything that is to do with preserving their own collection.
Nadia and I visited the new library with groups of Egyptian university students, Muslim and Christian, while Elizabeth Subsinski and other international experts were there. Bishop Mataeus received us graciously and engaged with the students. I was struck by how interested the young people were, not just in the challenges of preservation or the antiquity of the manuscripts, but in the story they tell of the history of Egypt and its church and its connectivity, the connectivity of the church across the wider region.
Up to date, when we were able actually to be on site, be it at the Deir al-Surian or be it in Cairo during our programs, training programs, which took place in 2009, 10 and 12, it was relatively easy to organize this practical workshop. However, within the latest training that was delivered in last December, practical workshop format had to be completely changed because of the COVID-19 situation and because this training was delivered using the digital technology via Zoom. One sector that is sometimes not included are children. And children are nowadays taught about lots of other things. They are not really taught about, for instance, history of writing, the history of how first books were made, what materials they were made of. So a first pilot was organized a year ago, and the children's response was absolutely wonderful. They are interested, they do want to know, and in fact, if you start with the youngest generation, you are beginning to build and generate this interest from the cradle, so to speak. The most important partnerships that the Levantine Foundation has is with the Deir al-Surian and with the support of His Grace Bishop Mataeus, who, with his encouragement and support, enabled us to achieve what we have to date. His contribution and his support and financial support for the construction of the library was huge. We as the foundation contributed to the construction of the library only a little bit, but it is actually the monastery's achievement. The other big partners in these achievements, and I would just like to mention a few, is the Sawiris Foundation for Social Development, partnerships with the Supreme Council of Antiquities, but I cannot overestimate the most important support from the British Council Cultural Protection Fund, whose financial support facilitated immense amount of training, field campaigns, and actually it is with their grant that the foundation made a huge leap in what was achieved pre-grant and what we have achieved up to date. I was extremely privileged working with Father Beygoul and getting to know him, because he has become one of my closest friends. He is an extremely erudite scholar with huge knowledge, not only about the Coptic manuscripts in the Deir al-Surian collection, but further beyond this collection. He is hugely erudite in Christian Arabic, also Syriac, and I think that he is one of these unique scholars who actually wants to share this knowledge. He wants to share it with the entire world.
I wish to the collection to survive for the future generations, and I wish to the collection to be in a very safe hand. I'm very glad that the Levantine Foundation and Elizabeth renewed the contract with the monastery for another year. This place is blessed by the child when the Holy Family came to Egypt. So every day we are enjoying in a living way these blessings of the child Jesus Christ for the monastery.